Welcome back to a Scuffed guide to building a Yeeps hide and seek, the show where today we're going to be talking about the basics of making your map look good. We've talked about preparing for your map and making it functional, and now we're going to talk about making it actually look good. And today we'll be using this house as an example. I used 4 of these big grass blocks as the plot and built a house, a tree, and a trampoline. So without further ado, let's get into the... Good building is pretty subjective, but I can give you a few pieces of advice that I can say probably objectively will make your builds look much better. The first tip I've got is to avoid blocky shapes. Now that's virtually impossible because most of the blocks in this game are blocks, that's why they're called that. But making your builds look less like a cube and more like a natural shape is always a good idea. Using depth and texture in your builds will always take them to the next level. Right now you're looking at the BAM 6 winning map, Nostalgic Halloween, by these people on screen. As you can see, this build uses depth and texture a ton. There's tons of points that are just sticking out of the build, so the walls aren't just a flat surface. It makes the build look 10 times better, even if you don't necessarily notice it and it's a little subtle. It makes the build just so much better. So even adding points of your build that stick out, maybe some windows that are in, or some pillars and stuff that point out, it just will definitely help your map look better. You should also apply this to your terrain. Terrain that looks like this is pretty bland. It almost looks unfinished. Whereas if you add some smaller blocks to it and make it more in depth, it'll actually improve the build so much better. I mean, this looks so much nicer. They also have the same surface area and height. This one just has some extra blocks around it. If you want to save space, you can also achieve this effect with less blocks. Like I said, this one still has the same height and surface area on the top. It just looks nicer, and this one doesn't have as many blocks as the last one. So you don't need a ton of blocks to add detail, but the more detail, the better, really. Just make sure that your builds don't have a bunch of flat surfaces, and add some depth to them, and it'll make it look so much better. The next piece of advice I have is to use elevation to your advantage. Each map is 80 blocks tall, and oftentimes I don't see enough people utilize that. If your map is at the same level everywhere, you're not using all the space you've been given. There are tons of ways to implement elevation, like the underground cave in Blue House or Playground. They have tall, towering structures everywhere. It's really just a good idea to use all 80 blocks of your height in your map. It'll also just help your map be fun to play and make it look so much larger than it actually is. The next advice I have is to use tons of details in your builds. Now this doesn't have to be crazy. I think that too many details is a real thing. You don't have that much room in your map, but you can still add a bunch. There are tons of blocks that are really just used for detailing. Adding things like gnomes, little boxes, flowers, windows, areas with pillows so you can grab them to refill cotton on the go. Tons of little details will take your map from a 10 to an 11. It'll just help the map feel more alive if there are little things everywhere that just add to the charm and personality of it. Jam-packing each build with details will really help it feel so much more alive and just exude charm. The last major tip I have is to use references. Whether you're referencing real-life builds, other Yeeps builds, or even like Minecraft builds, it will help you put your map together so much more effectively. I think references especially help with texture and depth, but they can help with anything. If you're not entirely sure what you want your build to look like, you can always look up an example online. Using references will just help your builds feel more real and look so much nicer. So when building your maps, remember to have texture and depth, use elevation to your advantage, add tons of little details, and use references. But instead of just telling you how to improve your builds, I'll be showing you using an example. At the beginning of this video, I showed you a house with a trampoline, just a basic little house, and a tree. There's nothing inside. Using the same space I was given here, I built this. This is the new and improved house. I mean, look at the side-by-side comparison. Which one would you put in your map? I added texture, making this separate from this, so I did make the house a little smaller, but it just made it feel more real. These pillars are holding up the roof now, instead of just being different color accents on the wall. I also added texture on like the tree. I added little parts of the ground that come up. I did details with flowers, mushrooms, gnomes, and even pillow plants and little twigs on the tree. I added elevation using the cave, and I used references by referencing Blue House itself. This tree that leads into the cave section is incredibly inspired by Blue House. Now that doesn't mean you have to rip off everything. This is kind of just a basic example. I do think that using these tips will take your builds to much better places. So that concludes my tips and tricks on making your builds look good. Next episode, we'll cover building with a team, something that's very important if you plan to play and build a map.
See you next time.